Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our series for our today's session in the Hillview Speaker Series, which aims to provide you with opportunities to hear from some of the greatest thought leaders, entrepreneurs, and disruptors across a variety of industries. And I'm particularly excited to welcome today's speaker, Geoffrey Moore, who's a best-selling author and visionary. He's also one of the most well-known high-tech strategists, and one of the most sought-after advisors on any topics that are central to the high-tech industry, ranging from market dynamics to business strategy to innovation, all the way to the future of certain industries. So Geoffrey brings an enormous wealth of knowledge and experience to this discussion. And as most of you know, his very famous book of Crossing the Chasm has brought insights and understanding on the innovation life cycle to a whole generation of business professionals and technology professionals. And he has just published his latest book, which is called Escape Velocity, Free Your Company from the Pull of the Past, where he has very uniquely and quite literally written the book on how to bring disruptive innovation to the marketplace. But also he outlines a very pragmatic plan on how to address one of the most common challenges facing particularly established companies in the 21st century, which is all about how do you move beyond your successes from the past and drive next generation growth, especially through new lines of business. And that sounds like a topic that's very relevant to us. And as you know, Geoffrey has a very strong connection to SAP. He's taken the stage at Sapphire on more than one occasion. I have personally had the great fortune to have worked with him on a project as well. And so I'm particularly excited to welcome Geoffrey Moore back to the SAP Palo Alto campus.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. Appreciate it. That's great.
Geoffrey, first of all, congratulations on the new books.
Well, great to be here.
It's getting rave reviews.
Thank you.
And it seems that you've written it at kind of exactly the right moment in time, considering the very volatile environment that we all live in. And so before we get into the sort of core concepts and frameworks of the book, let's take a look a little bit at the bigger picture, and maybe we can share with us some of the bigger trends that you've seen through your work with all the various companies who you've worked with.
Sure. So I think maybe just thinking about SAP and the world that kind of gets centered around Hillview here, if you look at the enterprise IT, for most of the 20th century, we were just building out the great systems of record, and SAP rose to enormous prominence in the last decade. And when we got to the Y2K phenomenon, we did one last sort of huge sort of feasting on systems of record. And then when the tech bubble burst, there was this downturn in enterprise IT, and when it came back, we were in a different world. It was this, and the analogy I try to use is that our colleagues outside of the IT profession were saying to us, you know, ERP is like the interstate highway system. If you don't have one, you have to build one. But once you've built one, you don't have to build it over and over and over again. And so what happened in the last decade was that the spending on an enterprise IT was the percentage of the budget being spent there began to shrink. Because people said, look, they associated enterprise IT almost exclusively with ERP, and they said, we need to maintain it, but we don't need to build it out again. So the last decade has been an interesting decade because it's been a decade where virtualization was probably the leading idea of the decade, which was essentially a cost-reducing idea. And we did lots of renegotiating of business models. In 2008, drove up an enormous amount of pressure on the thing and whatever. So it raised a question in the venture community: are we kind of done? I mean, is venture done with IT? I mean, consumer IT, meanwhile, was on fire, but what about enterprise IT? And I think the trend that I am most interested in right now is the enterprise has looked out, everyone in the enterprise, all of us in this room included, have looked into our consumer lives and said, look, we have this enormous empowerment in our consumer lives. So Saturday and Sunday, I feel like master of the universe. And then Monday I come to work and I feel like a dweeb. And it's like, what? And so how hard is it to get this stuff into the enterprise? Well, the answer is it's very hard. But the value of doing it is I think, People initially associated it with, well, the value will be the millennials. But the truth is, we have disaggregated the global business model so much that the need to coordinate and collaborate and communicate across organizational boundaries, across company boundaries, across national boundaries, global time zones, is just more and more fierce every single quarter. And so the notion of living without these capabilities is getting more and more painful. And so even though the enterpriseization of consumer IT is going to be a tricky business, I think that the world wants it, and I think that your work with Sybase and the mobile app is one example of that. But basically, they want an enterprise Facebook, they want an enterprise Google search, they want an enterprise YouTube, they want an enterprise Twitter. You know, now some of that may call chatter. I mean, you can see it kind of emerging with stuff. But I think that's a really interesting.
Now you're sort of bringing it to Facebook and Google and Twitter, which is all very local here in Silicon Valley and very prominent companies in Silicon Valley. How do you see some of those, trends that you just described play out, particularly in this very special part of the world?
Well, I think the very perceptually entitled part of the world. I mean, Silicon Valley can be its own trap, right? I think those companies are very, very consumer focused. And so although they make overtures to the enterprise community and the global enterprise, they're very US centric, they're very culturally US, and they're very volume operations consumer oriented. And so enterprises look at the facilities and they set the user experience bar, but the enterprise needs enterprise class systems. And right now the disconnect is still painfully hard to bridge. So there's an enormous amount of opportunity, and I think SAP is at the minimum. SAP has to say, we will make the systems of record that you are the stewards of about half the planet. So between you and Oracle, you kind of split the planet, and so the world say we're not going to remove these systems, but we need them to be somehow more accessible to the edge. And so how would you do that, and how would you participate in the edge? Given that you're a complex systems enterprise and your power, the closer you get to the core of an enterprise, the more powerful SAP becomes. Conversely, the further you get from the core toward the edge, the more you're playing a little bit outside of your sweet spot, but you have to. And the question is, how far will you reach out to do that? And that's always a demilitarized zone between the people who are stronger at the edge and the people that are stronger at the core. But there's an enormous amount of opportunity, and a whole lot of people want you to extend the assets that you were stewards of to make them more accessible, particularly to middle managers. Middle managers are the ones that really, and they've never really been served by the systems of record. The systems of record were always either for the transaction worker or for the business intelligence version, which was for the big boss. But the middle are the folks that are online in real time trying to solve real stuff, who need access not to a report, but they need, it's like, no, I'm in the middle of this problem and we got to expedite this order and I need to understand this particular shipping problem and I need it on my mobile because I need it now. And by the way, it's 4 a.m, Sunday, and I help. And so I think that kind of stuff that's more and more of what global enterprise systems are about. And that was not what they were designed for. They were designed for a much more stable, static, empire state building vision of the world. And God bless, that was problem number one, but that's not the current focus.
Excellent. So let's look a little bit at some of the things that you outline in the book, where one of the key concepts you introduced there is the notion of the hierarchy of powers. And I think there's about 5 different elements of this power. Can you talk us through kind of the core meaning of those hierarchies of power and maybe give us an example on how each one of these plays out?
Yeah, this is the core of the book, and so fortunately it's a very bright audience, so I will just, hopefully about 3 minutes you say, okay, I don't have to read the book, I got it. So the drill is, the whole point of this exercise was large companies get caught up in a series of performance commitments to the point of view that and every year, as the budgeting exercise begins in the 3rd quarter, there's always a certain amount of discretionary resources you can redeploy. But if you don't get out in front of that before the 3rd quarter hits, by the time the third quarter hits and the budget's sort of recirculated, we're going to do next year's budget, everybody is so desperate for resources just to make their commitments for next year that you end up absorbing all of the free resources in the system, essentially in service to your legacy businesses, because they're already built into the budget and they kind of get first dibs. And so you watch these companies who would go, you know, year after year after year with these really cool opportunities in R&D, but they weren't ever getting to be material businesses. And the problem is that you have this, the critical time in the gestation of the new business is when it's going from kind of a really cool idea that might be 10 to 15 to $20 million to something that's maybe $200 million, which is, okay, now we're getting a big enough thing we can kind of use the scale of SAP or Cisco or IBM or Microsoft to work on. So it was a power problem. We're trying to figure out how can we get enough power behind these initiatives to build them up to where we can deploy them at scale. So the hierarchy of power said, well, if you're going to think about it, have a conversation about power and sort of free yourself from the pull of the past, then the first thing is around categories. So the five powers are, they go from broadest but takes the longest to show results to most focused, most immediate. So it's category power, what categories are you in, then how powerful is your company, then which markets are you focused on and how valuable are they relative to other market choices, and then how successful are your offers, and then finally, how successful are you executing against the offers? And so it's sort of from there to there. So when you look at you guys, you say, okay, category power is the first issue. ERP, you have an enormous company power in a category that is no longer going to support breakout growth. So it gives you a seat at the table for as long as I'm on this planet, like for, you know. So the great news is you're there. But the bad news is if you don't do anything else, you're going to be increasingly, yeah, you're there, you're like the interstate highway system. And if you've seen how we neglect our interstate highway system, you can say, okay, that's not exactly where I want to be in the future. So you say, okay, but I'm there. And there are not a lot of people that have a seat at the table, and you do, and it's a permanent seat. So the business intelligence, and you've worked with some categories, and sometimes we've struggled, and you know, we tried to do some things with SaaS, and that didn't work very well. And we tried to do some things with smaller businesses, and that didn't work very well. But business intelligence has, you know, and you acquired somebody and you assimilated them, and that's its own challenge. But you took in a new category that was adjacent to ERP, and now it's no longer adjacent. It now feels like it's more joined. And the opportunity in business intelligence, as you guys well know, is very large, particularly around analytics. So that's a pretty darn interesting category. All this stuff, what I call systems of engagement, the communication systems that will overlay onto the systems of record to help people solve problems, that's another category. And to the degree which you participate in that one, that's another set of opportunities. You've got this mobile, and I would argue that your mobile, Sybase Mobile is a system of engagement. It's a way in which users can interface interactively with the systems that you create. So in the category world, I think the analytics is a very, very, very big idea. And so just even that alone could be as big as ERP. And so you think, okay, I think there's always new categories for us to be thinking about. The Hana stuff doesn't feel to me like it's a new category so much as it's a redefining of the capabilities of an existing world. So you think about categories pretty good. Our company power, we're really, really strong in ERP. We were strong in BI in the original definition of BI, which was kind of analytics to make executives smart, which is not an easy thing to do. But that was there. But this notion of analytics in the next generation, I think, is still up for grabs. And that's where I think Hana becomes really interesting. Because as we try to make more and more of the information systems have a feedback loop during the transaction, so that you actually modify the transaction via an analytical loop before the transaction consummates. So the performance demands are enormous, the analytic demands are enormous, and the security issues and making it's a big, big problem. And it's right in your wheelhouse. I mean, I don't know how far down that road you can go, but you probably have first dibs. So that's where your company power, I think, the danger in your world would be if you just said, well, you know, SAP, it's an ERP company, what's your question, right? That would be a place where you could say, well, boy, we could get trapped in the pull of our past. And financial markets often ask you to do that because they say, well, you know, you make a lot of money from here. Come on, guys, you know, just tell us another happy story about how wonderful ERP is. And it's like, no, we're going to take some risk. We're going to move out into some new areas because the world's moving. So, but you have a big footprint. You're very, very strong with the CIOs, very strong. You're pretty strong with the CFOs. You're not as strong as you need to be with the rest of the enterprise. And part of that is because the rest of the enterprise is much more oriented towards systems of engagement, and they see you as a system of record. So this need to mobilize your app, it's not that the mobile app itself is, I don't know how much revenue it's going to make, but it's the way you've got to get your face in front of the rest of the enterprise in more interesting ways. And so the user experience for the senior executives in your client base, and even in the middle managers in your client base, needs to get a lot better. And it's not just that it needs a better user interface. It's no, you need to. I need to be able to engage with you during my actual business problem-solving moments, and have you deliver to me the stuff I need to know when I need to know it. And that you'll have to collaborate with Microsoft. You'll have to collaborate with you know, whoever, all the other communication and collaboration technologies that you're going to be exposed to. But you have to be proactive there. If you're not, then you'll end up looking like just a tool for corporate and not a tool for the rest of us kind of stuff. Which it wouldn't be the end of the world, but it would start being the marginalization. So you have interesting category power, very, very strong company power in your traditional places. Need to develop, I think, company power outside of the CIO-CFO relationship. You know, Sanjay's got that whole stuff oriented around lines of business, plus you've got the whole thing around verticals. Both of those are great ways to get power outside of the CIO-CFO execs, but you've got to do it with things that are more immediately, that feel more businessy and less IT-ish than I suspect it feels today. At least that'd be my guess. Then market power is the next one down. And the issue with that, it can be geo-markets, geographic markets, it can be vertical markets, whatever. You're very well aligned by vertical markets. By the way, Cisco is not, just to pick another great company who, so you know, every company has the things that they're good at and the things that they're not, you know, that they could work on. So you do not need to work on your vertical alignment. Maybe the user experience within it, but not that. I wonder, I don't know how you're doing in China. I don't know how you're doing in all the developing economies. But let's face it, that's where the growth is going to be in this century. So all of us grew up, at least I grew up and Barbara grew up in a world where the developed economies, not only were they the source of technology, they were the great, I mean, the US was the great growth market for the planet. And everybody had to come to the US in order to figure out if they could win or not. Well, not in this decade. Well, maybe in this decade still to some degree, but not in this century. And so all of a sudden, tech is going to inherit a bunch of business and dynamics in our home geographic market, at least for the US-centric tech, and this goes for Silicon Valley too, that we've never played away games before. We've always played home games. And so it's like, oh, you have to actually go to the other guy's field to play an away game. So what is that going to look like? And I don't know how it is for you. I think coming from Germany, as a German company, you have a big advantage over companies that have grown up pretty much with a US-centric world. And Americans are extremely good at being US-centric. It's one of our strongest suits. As John Cleese once said, he said, you know, if Britain held an event called the World Series, we would invite other countries. And by the way, Silicon Valley is even worse, right? I mean, then we get into the elitism of Silicon Valley, and you just have to be careful. So anyway, so that's category power, company power, market power. Offer power is the differentiation of the thing you produce. And it's important, you know, in mature categories, it's nowhere near as important to be highly differentiated because by then the customers have sort of sorted it out and they don't really want to change vendors. But in dynamic categories, offer rules. So you see these startups coming out of, particularly in consumer tech right now, where they just appear out of nowhere because they've got a really compelling offer. And of course, I guess the most obvious example that everybody's been talking about for the last decade is Apple did it with 3 unbelievable offer power moments. And just completely revolutionized 3 categories, which you would have said is impossible, but they did it with offer power. I think in the case of enterprise IT, I think I think Hana is probably the closest thing I'm hearing about right now, and I don't know where Hana is in its life cycle or in its adoption stuff. I'd love to learn more about it. But if you add Hana to a bunch of other processes and it could do what you would hope it could do in terms of just accelerating the cycle time, that could fundamentally transform the offer from a sort of historical view of a system of record to an actual, to an actually dynamically engaging system of engagement where and you think, wow. I mean, and you kind of see that in e-commerce situations a bunch of times. So it'd be interesting to see where that goes. That's offer power. And by the way, this lab is really key to offer power. And then the last one is execution power. And the key execution power idea is, and this is the hardest one for large companies to struggle with, is when you decide to do something different, can you take the strategic initiative far enough down the road to get to a tipping point where it can become the new status quo. What happens in a lot of large companies is they have these wonderful strategic initiative after strategic initiative. They're brilliant, they're exciting, they're launched with great fanfare, and then somewhere along the second or third year they kind of start to flutter and waffle, and then all of a sudden you don't hear about them as much anymore. It's like, whatever happened to Ernie? I don't know what happened to Ernie. I think he's not here anymore. So the issue is, can you get it to the tipping point? And it turns out that this is where the metrics of a performance culture can be dangerous, because if the truth is, until the initiative gets to the tipping point, no other metric matters, and every other metric is actually potentially a mistake. So how much revenue it's making, how much profit it's making, how many users it has, I don't care what the metric is. Until you've gotten enough adoption to get to the tipping point, it's not the metric that matters. The adoption, once it gets adopted enough to be a going concern, then all of those metrics will matter. But the way we kill things in large companies, and the way you have killed things before in your large company, is you've held the sort of fledgling initiative to a series of metrics that you compare them to those metrics, and it looks like, well, why the hell would we do that anymore, right?
That all sounds very familiar.
That's kind of what the book but by the way, I did work on Sun Tzu for a couple of years, so this is completely a brand new story. Okay.
Can you share an example? It seems like, especially in the last category of power, the execution power, that's where the famous rubber meets the road. Yeah. Can you share an example of a company that you've seen especially strong in that sort of last mile?
Well, so
kind of what they did.
Right. So there's two kinds of things. First of all, there's the one that has the unbelievably charismatic CEO who just drives. So Jobs, obviously, 3 times in a row, took the iPod, which was not a very impressive idea when that showed up, the iPhone, which seemed highly improbable, and the iPad, which you thought, tablet computing, please. But in every case, he drove it. Okay, so that's one. And by the way, Bezos is another kind of guy like that. But I would say that those kinds of leaders, you know, the reason we can name them by name is because it's very hard to get to the fifth digit in one hand, right? And it's called the Fortune 500, and you know that's more than 5 in 500. So you say, well, how could kind of mere mortals do that? And the second place that you see it happen is when you have near-death experiences. So Lou Gerstner comes into IBM, and he completely turns the place around from a hardware-centric, you know, company that gave away the software and services to a software and services-centric company that doesn't give away the hardware by any means, but at least, you know, kind of revitalized itself going forward. So a third place, and the kind of place I'll give an example of a company called BMC, which is not a particularly large company. You guys, many of you probably know BMC, but kind of in the computer associates, you know, sort of CompuWare, infrastructure stuff. But here's the reason I know Bob Beecham pretty well. He's the CEO there, and he had a situation where he's trundling along, and he's got some good metrics, and you know, business. You know, he's got this sort of business-oriented infrastructure, and people are saying, "We kind of buy your act." And all of a sudden, they realize, you know, for us, cloud is going to put us out of business if we're not careful. And everybody can see that, but then it's like, yeah, but if I have to take my resources away from my core business to get into cloud, there's going to be a hole in my performance, and I'm going to get crucified. And that so that was an external example, and Bob, bit that bullet and said, look, there are times when you have to do that. You just have to suck it up. I was with the guys at Nvidia this morning, and Nvidia's been a graphic processor unit for time immemorial. Took out Silicon Graphics. It's had a hell of a run, $3 billion business, about $1 billion in chipsets. And AMD, all of a sudden, and AMD was their key partner, but AMD was going to take the chipset inside their thing. And it was like, we're going to have $1 billion hole in our future. And so all of a sudden, they had to invest in these things called Tetra, and they've got one called Tesla, which is not the car, but their high-end thing. But again, Jen had to sort of step up to that. So there's that kind of situation. And then on internal initiatives, I think internal is the same thing. There's a moment where they always talk about CEO sponsorship or executive sponsorship. But the truth is, it's a lot of us in this room that at the margin I think you certainly need the leadership from the top to say, look, we're not going to be able to do everything. We are going to make sure this one wins. So for example, Chambers took telepresence through Cisco, and it was like, telepresence was going to win because John just literally was going to make it win. But when the next 27 initiatives kind of came to the door, there's about room for one to get through at a time. They all got clogged up, and that's how they got in trouble. So I think you have to be very sparing in how many of these things you try to do, but when you do it, you have to stack hands and say, we're just not going to let this thing fail. Because it's so easy in a large company to go, well, really, that's Barbara's initiative, it's not mine. It's good luck, Barbara, I'm here for you. I really am. I'm really here to support you. And it's like, ooh.
See you, have fun.
Right, yeah, exactly. And so if you have 20 or 30 initiatives, you're bound to have that attitude, because what else could you do? So I do think it's important to get it down to one or two initiatives, which is what Bob had to do at BMC, and we had to do it at Akamai, where I'm on the board. We had to do it with our next generation stuff. And those initiatives reported out to the board. Every quarter, even though they were a fraction they started at like 2% of revenue. And they reported out to the board until eventually they became more than 50% of our profits. But there's a period in between where you're putting your best people on something that is so small, you're thinking, how can I afford to do this? And you have to say, because this is the future. And if it's not the future, we've made a terrible mistake. But if we don't invest now, by the time we want to, it'll be too late. So.
Which brings us to the whole concept of asymmetry, right? That you introduce in the book, and how, where you're recommending to companies to invest in an asymmetrical way or allocate resources in an asymmetrical way to the innovations that are going to be really important for the future. Now, we all know how hard that is. Can you talk us through some of the things that you guide companies to do in making some of these tough decisions to say, this is what we're going to bet the future on, and we're happy to sacrifice or happy to live with the holes that we have in other areas?
So they're never happy. It's the happy to live with holes is not a sentence that actually decodes in English. But so what does happen, though, is if you try to have that conversation around the tough bet and the asymmetrical resource allocation during the budgeting process, my belief is it won't happen. By the time the budgeting process starts, it becomes so intense and it becomes such a zero-sum game that to try to do strategy and annual planning and budgeting on the same rhythm, I think it's one of the mistakes I call out in the book. So the first thing is I try to say is, let's go the quarter before that exercise starts. So, in your case, the second quarter of the year would be probably the time to do that. And when you do that, you have to be honest with yourself and say, we probably have 2 to 4% of the resource of the company we can play with here. It's not like we have 25%. Yes, we have a big R&D budget, but most of that's already pre-allocated. So then you start getting down to that. And then what people do, if you do not take that 2 to 4% and make a very asymmetrical allocation with it, you'll get the peanut butter memo from Brad Garlinghouse, right, when he was at Yahoo, which says, and because everybody needs a little extra. And once you get into the third and fourth quarter, I don't know whether you get the head count or I get it, but whoever gets it, we're not giving it back, right, because we need it. And so it becomes that sort of way. And so making the asymmetrical bet, if it's going to happen, should happen, in my view, in the second quarter. And there will be like somewhere between 4 and 10 candidates, and I want you to fund one and then have all other, which really means I want you to have 9 in the queue or waiting, but don't try to bring, this is probably too simplistic, but I'm Irish and we like simple things, which we say over and over again as loudly as we can. But the idea would be to pick the thing and say, look, it's not that we couldn't fund another initiative, but whatever your first in line is, I want you to stack hands and say, we will not let this initiative fail. In fact, we're willing to have our total compensation for the entire year depend in part on the success of everybody's, depend in part on the success, because everybody in this room at some level can affect any initiative in the company at the margin, because you'll be asked for help for that. You know how we're always trying to help each other out to get stuff through a large corporation. So but that asymmetrical says there is one that is anointed above all others. They get the resourcing first, and we resource that initiative without compromise. And then whatever's left over, we do whatever's left over. And my experience is you probably don't really want to try to do the two in 1 year, because I just think the leftovers aren't quite enough. I'd rather take whatever's left over and then do peanut butter that against an agenda, for them.
And once you've made that bet on which is the initiative that you're really going to focus on and fund without compromise, and bring that sort of dramatic, disruptive innovation to the market, how do you defend it? How do you help companies to kind of make sure it doesn't get copied by the next company down the road?
Well, it may get. I mean, it doesn't have to be. I mean, part of it is particularly when you're as large as Cisco or SAP or IBM or Microsoft, or even if I go down a generation, you get to a size of $1 billion to $5 billion corporation. It doesn't. The larger you are, the less disruptive it has to be. But what it has to be is transformative. So I mean, take Hana as an example. I don't know that Hana is a dramatically disruptive innovation, but it could potentially be a very transformative one. So if you say, look, that is the bet we're going to make, then the first thing you do internally is you say, everybody, even if you have nothing to do, even if you think you have nothing to do with Hana, Hana is job one for everybody at SAP. I'm picking as an example. It may be something else it ought to be, but let's use that one. So you say, well, I'm sorry, I sell business objects. Yes, and part of your bonus this year will depend on the success of Hana. But I don't sell Hana. Yeah, I know. Too bad. So think about it. And by the way, if there's something you can think of to do to help, by all means do. Well, guess what? I happen to know the CIO at so-and-so who would be the guy who would talk to the Hana guy if I bothered to introduce the Hana guy to him. But why would I bother? Oh, now I will bother, right? So all of a sudden, that stuff. Once you do, and once you get these asymmetrical bets going, what you discover is your competitors get out of your way. If you genuinely make an asymmetrical bet, look at what the competitors get out of Apple's way right now. Because the bet is so asymmetrical, they know they cannot match it from inside their company, even though their company is bigger than Apple. Because they know they can't negotiate that kind of asymmetry inside their own company. The risk is when you peanut butter, then it becomes easy for everybody to sort of pigeonhole you and copy you and sort of do that. So the asymmetry itself creates a barrier to entry that I think is powerful.
Great. So also in the book, and as part of kind of making those bets and making it happen, you also suggest a very active M&A strategy. On the other side, I think you're also asking company to have a laser focus on the in-house innovation. How do you reconcile those two, and how do they fit together?
Yeah, it's great. The problem is the larger you get, the harder it is for an organic innovation to get to a material size in any reasonable business horizon. And so therefore you start thinking, well, therefore we should start acquiring. We should, and your friends up at Redwood Shores have decided that that's pretty much those. You're good friends. No, you really love their database. Really, you do. You do. You have. Maybe you will.
We have loved, yes.
Databases is so 20th century, so last century. But anyway, but the problem with if you're trying to build, if you're acquiring what Oracle is doing is they're acquiring to consolidate. That actually is fine. You can acquire to consolidate, and Computer Associates did that brilliantly in the 80s and early 90s, and they're playing that play there. That's great. But if you're trying to do breakout growth in a new thing. That's not the kind of acquisition that works. The problem, if you don't innovate internally, we've seen this happen again and again, where the company acquires a breakout growth opportunity, but there's no receptors for it inside the hosting corporation, the buying corporation. We've seen, Microsoft buy a bunch of businesses. We saw Yahoo buy a bunch of businesses. We saw Cisco buy some businesses, and some of them flourished, and others died on the vine. And the ones that died on the vine tend to be ones which had no internal group which really understood the nature of the problem. So I think what you want to do when you're the size of SAP is you want to pick out the categories that you think are the places to go. I think you want to actively, aggressively, and quickly, almost with venture speed, get into those categories and try to build a business of maybe from 0 to $100 million, or maybe whatever, somewhere along the line. As you're doing that, and once you get enough sort of experience under your belt to realize, okay, now I know what good looks like, and I also know where the bodies are buried, now we can go acquire something. And the team that was organically building it has to lead the acquisition. And they have to confront the fact of, even though we would love to build this all ourselves, there is not world enough in time to do that. So we've got to go buy something to help us do that. And we're going to buy into an architecture, and it's not our architecture exactly. So you guys are struggling a little bit with Sybase right now, is to figure out, well, what parts can I absorb and what not. And you did with business objects, when you first acquired business objects. But at some point you say, I can bolt that into the company, and then what happens is the new management team has internal allies who know how SAP works. Because if you just come in, I don't care how good a management team you are, if I parachute you into any large corporation and you do not have internal allies to sort of kind of explain to you how to work the system and who have the web of relationships necessary to work a large corporation, it doesn't matter how good you are, the organ transplant will fail, because there's just too much antibody in any system. So I like organic innovation as the way of entering the category, and then at some point, and not too soon, but not too late. So then, blah blah blah, consultant, not too much, whatever. But a little Goldilocks solution, right? That you say, okay, at that point, I'd like to bolt on something. And it doesn't, by the way, the thing you bolt on doesn't have to be very big, because if your people inside know how to activate your sales capability and your services capability and your existing install base relationships, you guys can take a 100 million business to $1 billion much, much faster than anybody else on the planet. If basically all it really requires is just scaling. And so, that's the.
And where do you see co-innovation fit into this?
Well, I think that's back to that issue of building your relationships beyond the CIO and the CFO. So, and I think the verticals are the most obvious place to do this. So, what happens in I think you're in 24 verticals. Is that somebody told me? Jeff maybe told me that. So 24 verticals. So at any given time, probably 3 to 5 verticals are in transition, meaning their world is just being turned inside out. Media and advertising right now, their world is being turned completely inside out. So co-innovation to me is about going to the industries that are in dramatic transition, where the transition relates to IT, and saying, okay, let us engage with you initially in project mode to build whatever it is to build. And now hopefully you got to bring some core assets to it. But basically the promise initially is we'll look a lot more like a systems integrator in the first few things we do in your industry, because we need to really immerse ourselves in the problem statement before we come with a solution statement. The biggest danger you guys have is you have such a library of solutions, you get into the tendency of thinking, I'm the answer, what is your question? And so in your marketing, it's like, well, marketing is I will just tell you more about my answer until you finally hear an answer that resonates with your question. And what you would like to have is, no, we'd like to actually listen before you talk. So what these projects are about is co-innovation listening. So I think the key then is to be able to have enough discretionary resource to play that game, because those people are extremely valuable. They're typically systems architects or application architects. There are a handful of them that are really world class. Everybody wants them for some immediate project. And so again, that's part of that second quarter. Are we going to carve out a certain amount of resource, but not, it's 2 to 4%. It's not that kind of 400% or whatever. So I think you do that, and I remember you did it. I remember you did something with Colgate once that we were talking about when we were doing our project. That was an example of that, where you took on a kind of a trade promotion thing in that vertical that was challenging, and that's the kind of stuff where it really makes a difference. And people, by the way, if you or IBM or Cisco or Microsoft or Oracle or HP show up and say, we would like to put our enterprise in service to your problem, customers will weep. I mean, they really will. You always have permission to co-innovate if you don't show up saying, I have the answer, what was your question? Which is unfortunately where, every large company does a lot of that.
Okay. Just one more question from my side, because then we want to open it up for Q&A as well. Sure. Where do you see, actually 2 questions, where do you see SAP having been very successful in having brought a sort of very important innovation to the market?
Well, the first time I met you guys was when Shai had just kind of come in. And, so Netweaver was, at that time, remember there was WebSphere and there was WebLogic and there was .NET. And you guys had a really interesting innovation problem, which was, if you did not solve for the app server, you were going to have to serve 3 app servers, or you were going to have to subordinate yourself to IBM, Microsoft, or BEA. And so what you guys did with Netweaver was amazing. Now, I think the problem was that Netweaver, I think at some point was set up to be, well, we'll be the web app server and the other 3 will go away. The world didn't want you to be an infrastructure app server company. But what I don't think you might have appreciated is how you freed your future from a trap. You were in a trap. And if you had not figured out a way to refactor and kind of rebuild the R3 suite around Netweaver, that was kind of an amazing thing. I think this Hana thing's interesting. I think the original thing also just around, just remember in 1992 when client server first came in, how SAP's business solutions were like just miles ahead of where the other client server stuff was. And so I don't know what you did or when you did that, but that was the other amazing thing for me.
Now, of course, I'm sure the question on everybody's mind in the room is, the book is a great read and those are fantastic concepts. How do you make it actionable? What can people in the room do to kind of take some of these concepts and, tomorrow when they come back to work, do things differently?
I think the one that's most, the concept that's most close to this room, I think, is around offer innovation, because at least when I'm thinking of Palo Alto, I tend to think of it as a R&D-centric world. And offer innovation, you separate into 3 kinds of outcomes. Either we're going to create an offer that will radically differentiate SAP and drive the next generation of adoption. There's a bunch of innovation you do around what we call performance or neutralization, which is, this is not going to differentiate us, but if we don't keep up with the world, we're going to eventually fall out of favor. And the way you do, so that's what sometimes we call that neutralization innovation. So differentiation, the poster child for differentiation innovation for the last 10 years has been Apple. The poster child for neutralization innovation is Microsoft. Microsoft really never created the differentiating thing, but think how many innovations it neutralized and eventually absorbed into its world. And the world is actually happy for Microsoft to do that, and they're happy for you to do that. So you should not dishonor neutralization. And then productivity innovation is the third one, which is, it's like, couldn't we do this in a way that's a little less wasteful internally so we had more resource? So I think that going back and looking at your project, but what you discover, by the way, is differentiation, the goal's got to be beyond compare. So it's like unmatchable. Neutralization, the goal is good enough, quick enough. So just to think about, and everybody gets differentiation, and every engineer wakes up and wants to be on that project, right? But the truth of the matter is, the bigger you are, the more important neutralization is to your customers. and neutralization being quick enough. So I'll give you the example. So Apple does this iPhone. Okay, God, if you're not an Apple, you just must be sick of hearing about them, right? So then you say, okay, but look what happened. So Google came out with Android. As good as iOS? Not even close. But it came out quickly. And then Motorola jumped on Android. And by the way, even BlackBerry got a kind of a torchy, Apple-y-like thing. Is it an iPhone? Hell no. But if you want to type with your thumbs, it's kind of close. But look who didn't do anything. Nokia. It didn't do anything. So 4 years later, Nokia, the largest mobile device manufacturer in the world, is the one that's on the bubble. It's the one that everybody's questioning right now. Not because it didn't differentiate, because it didn't neutralize. And the bigger you are, the more important it is to do it good enough, quick enough. And the art of good enough, quick enough is not celebrated. In this valley in particular, it's not celebrated anywhere near enough. Because we like to do...
Sounds like a good book title.
Yeah, there you go.
Art of good enough, quick enough.
Right.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Geoffrey.
Well, thank you.
I want to give some of the colleagues in the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. We have some mics running.
And if your here's one right here. Yeah, if your crap detector went off, I mean, just, by all means, raise an issue.
Hey, Geoffrey.
Hey.
So a few years ago,
you look familiar.
The light goes
all
on.
All the way back to Sun, maybe.
Yeah, I think Sun.
I think so. Yeah.
I think I met you when you were doing a book tour for Crossing the Chasm before publication.
Oh, so we are a little bit older than some of our colleagues in the room.
We go back, yeah. But a few years ago, you were consulting with us around value versus volume, with the idea that no one company is good at both value and volume. And I think that was, sort of around our SaaS offering and whatnot, yeah? But now as we think about edge and core, and how do we create these systems of engagement, it seems to me that the systems of engagement are volume-oriented, and the core is value-oriented. So now it's not a choice. We have to bridge this gap between value and volume. And how do you manage those two very different regimes?
This is really a key issue. So the phrases we're using in the book are complex systems model and volume operations model. Core, edge, value, volume, same idea. And the claim is no organization can afford to be good at both at scale. And HP was the last big shot at that. We just saw somebody from SAP go and say, no, it's got to be value. And now you have somebody from eBay may say, no, it's got to, whatever. But setting that one aside, our friends at Cisco have realized, okay, look, we're core, not whatever. I think you're absolutely right that the edge has to be part of the solution. I don't think you can lead on the edge. I think you have to find partners, whether it's the HTML5 community, whether it's Microsoft, whether it's... I don't think it'll be Google and Facebook, because I think they're just way too consumer-oriented. Could it be jive-ish, yammerish, chatterish? I don't know. But whatever it is, you're going to play defense at the edge and offense at the core. But the question is, how far can you move the demilitarized value creation zone out? And at some point, what you will do is you'll get out to a certain point, and you'll say, for us to proprietary try to go SAP all the way to the edge, it's too far. I mean, Shai and I had this discussion when it was Duet, right? And Duet, partnering between gorillas is no fun, but it's the right idea. Which is let somebody at the edge have a shot at doing what they're doing well, but at least get the more you can shove your API out toward the edge, the more you get to capture the intermediate value. At some point, you have to give away. And by the way, nobody is going to own the device on our hips. It's going to be our device. No CIO is going to own that. So you don't need to own that. But like the mobile app server is a wonderful example of moving the value creation point out from the core, because if you're a CIO, if you don't have a mobile app server, it's like, well, where the hell how do I keep this thing at bay? And so I think that's what you're going to do. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions?
By the way, give that man a book.
He already got one. So here's the incentive for asking a question. Right. Well done, Richard. Paul.
Hi. So I want to go back to your comment earlier about systems of engagement and systems of record. It's a clarification question, really. What are the components of the system of engagement, and does it actually contain the system of record, or do the two sit side by side?
I think they sit one on top of the other. So the system of record kind of wants to live in a fortress, wants to be secure, wants to be the single source of the truth, wants to be very centralized. And the system of engagement wants to be very, very close to the user, coming from the user experience. So the idea of a system of engagement was, the phrase came from, what do Google plus Facebook plus Twitter plus YouTube plus Pandora plus, whatever your current Zappos, what do they all have in common? And it was this feeling that we're engaging with things in a way that, for those of us who started with green screens, it was like, we're a long way away from green screens. And there is this flavor that systems of engagement tends to be volume ops oriented, and systems of record wants to be complex systems oriented. So I think that's where it is, and I think you have to make your bet. If you go too far out into the system of engagement world and the volume ops world, people will just discount you. Your power will plummet, and you'll be like, for example, when people were trying to sell Business One, or was Business One, what was it called? B1. We had a bunch of them, and it was a perfectly good product. Like, it was the #1 product in Israel, or whatever. And then we were going to try to sell it in 47 countries, and in 46 countries it was like, okay. So it wasn't a bad offer, but it was from the wrong company. And the world will not give you permission to be everything. So I think with systems of engagement, systems of engagement from SAP doesn't sound like the first thought that comes to mind. But SAP, the foundation that supports systems of engagement, wow, what did you mean by that? I might believe that. And if particular you did things to allow the security issues and the access issues around and the ad hocness of a systems of engagement. I think you guys will solve for the security issue. I think you'll solve for that. I'm not sure you will solve well for the reality of my life as a middle manager, which is I don't know the data I'm going to ask for until the second I ask for it. Can you really support search? Because I really need you to support search, because I don't know what I'm asking for. So if it has to be prefabricated in any way, it won't be what I need. And so if you could do something like that and say we can have a search function against our systems of record that can be invoked in this ad hoc a way, I think that'd be miraculous. I think that would be just like, whoa. And that would be what I meant. Gentlemen here would like a book too. This man gets a book. Coming over here.
There's
behind you. Well, okay, all right, okay.
You get two.
Okay. Hey, Geoffrey, how are you?
Fine, thank you. Good to see you.
Yep. Question around the install base, particularly for large companies, we always have an install base. And
install base, yes, okay.
And when you bring in install base of customers,
yes,
that is.
Yes, yeah.
And when you bring in a new innovation like Netweaver or Hana, all the effort tends to be focused around use cases or problems for the install base. But the product might be suitable outside the install base. And we never tend to kind of make offers in that area. So what's your advice to reach new markets outside the install base for new innovations?
So you actually have to hive out a special, you have to take a sales capability, and I wouldn't even try to pull it out of your existing account capabilities. Because if you look at the SAP relationship map, most of your salespeople have relationships with the CIO. And the CIO's life is made miserable by innovation, not made happy. So any really interesting innovation will never, well, not never, but almost never be sponsored by the CIO. It'll be sponsored by a line of business executive who's saying, I see a possibility here. I know it's going to be hard to implement, but it's worth it to me. So that means you need to have a go-to-market capability which is highly focused on that domain problem that CXO but not CIO has. Well, that means you need to have a kind of a very domain-oriented sales capability, and also some systems integration or systems to do those early project kind of co-innovation capability, all of that. So the mistake that most large companies make is they get a great product like whatever's disruptive, and they think, well, we can sell this to everybody. And the answer is no. Everybody, the last thing everybody wants to see from you is none of your install base wants to see a differentiation offer from SAP. They want to see more neutralization offers and more productivity offers. So give me, keep up with the category and make it cheaper, and that will make my life better, and don't make headaches for me. And so your sales force is kind of codependent with your install base, and that's kind of how it works. But when you really want to do something new, you've got to end run the whole thing. And the problem is if your existing account manager tries to end run the CIO, he'll get his head chopped off. So it's got to be somebody who has plausible deniability, who's kind of coming in from the side and doing it. But you have to do it because all early pre-Chasm stuff is always there is the occasional visionary CIO, but that's a fairly limited group of people. CIOs are pragmatists. I mean, that's why they can keep the job for more than a year. But so therefore, you got to get the sponsorship from outside. Yeah.
Great. A book for Ahmed.
Yeah. Maybe one last.
We probably
question.
One more.
I'll stick around forever, but I mean, we're running out of time.
Geoffrey, you were earlier describing the asymmetry part, which I found fascinating, which really means use a bigger hammer that everybody gets out of your way. What you're describing is you can either only do that if you have a tyrant CEO who can push that through no matter at what cost, or if you're almost dead. Well, and it kind of seems to me that it is what you're describing as this asymmetry, putting all your eggs in one basket and betting the farm is irresponsible to stockholders and a regular running company of a regular size, and the markets will go against you and pretty quickly fire you as a CEO. What do you say in those cases?
That's great. That's great. So I love it. So that's why I was trying to get to that 2 to 4% of resources. When I said asymmetrical bet, that's not betting the farm, but it is betting the seed corn for next year. In other words, right? The farm is still a going concern, but if you're not a tyrant CEO or you're not in a near death, because those do create places where you can bet 10 to 20 to 30 to 40. I mean, I don't know how much of the company Gerstner bet, but you bet a lot of the company because you have permission. But most of the time you have permission to bet 2 to 4% of the company. But if you will bet that 2 to 4% and truly, really, really, really resource allocate one initiative end to end, and by the way, it's not the R&D budget that's the problem. It's the sales force allocation that's the problem. Because the sales force, the person that you want, if the capability you want to sell that thing, you say, man, if I have somebody that good, they could generate $2 or $5 million worth of revenue over here. In putting over here, they're going to generate $100,000 to $300,000 worth of revenue because it's very disruptive. Man, I could use it over there. So that's the one. That's the place where people want a peanut butter, and they end up saying, why can't our regular sales force sell that? And we get back into the problem we were just talking about with the install base. So, and then there's also, by the way, the last. I'll just close with this comment. The financial markets are no longer our friends. So I wrote a book where the subtitle was called Managing for Shareholder Value. And that was the idea was that there was such a thing as a shareholder. The average holding period for a share of stock in this country has gone below a year. So it's like, so why would anybody have an interest in your 2 to 3 year J-curve idea? And so at some point we have to take back, we have to rebalance the equation. When I joined business, there was a guy named Peter Drucker who said, look, there are stakeholders. The shareholder is clearly a stakeholder. So is the employee, so is the customer, so is the partner, so is the community that hosts the business. What's happened over the last 20 years, and then the pressure, and particularly in tech, was the shareholder became wildly over-empowered, and everybody else the customer got kind of some power, and then everybody else got just creamed. And so we're now very badly out of balance. And then when the financial markets completely capitulated and kind of went into this tailspin, now the problem is we've over-empowered the one person who's sort of toxically drunk at the helm. So we've got, as a society, we have to renegotiate that contract. And I'm on the board of directors of a public company. So it's like, we live with this problem. But we have, as a society, we've got to find some way to. I don't think Occupy Wall Street's quite exactly the right answer, but it's a cry for the right problem. And in a way, it's a bunch of people saying we've really gotten out of balance with our sort of kowtowing to the financial market.
Geoffrey, thank you so much.
My pleasure to be here.
For all your thoughts and your insights.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I really did enjoy it. Thank you. Thanks.